Thank you all for being on time to the written version of our aptitude test. This test includes 2 essay questions and 93 multiple choice questions. The first portion of the test is...
Students applying for a graduate school program take a standardized exam.
At this time, you may now open your test booklets to page 2 where it says Section 1. You may begin.
Will the test reveal the best candidate for the program? Will the highest scorer be the most intelligent? What do we mean by intelligence?
No one agrees on what intelligence is, and that's long-standing. In the early 1900s, there was a symposium conducted by the Journal of Educational Psychology, where about 24 experts in the field of intelligence were asked what it is, and they didn't agree with each other. But the 2 main characteristics that came out of that symposium are the ability to adapt to the environment and the ability to learn from experience.
Is it a single ability, described as general intelligence, or G, that manifests itself in multiple ways, and some people have more of it, and those who do are better mathematicians, and they're better verbally, and they're better artistically?
On that view, which was first introduced by Charles Spearman in 1904, all tests of ability should correlate positively with each other, because it's just one big G, or general factor.
Or are there multiple intelligences that are essentially independent of one another, such that people who are artistically gifted may not be verbally gifted, and those who are verbally gifted may be mathematically and spatially relatively modest in their gifts?
Standardized tests, when used properly, can provide valuable objective information. They can, for example, highlight academic strengths and weaknesses that might otherwise go unnoticed.
Remember that intelligence tests, as devised originally, were really academic aptitude tests. That is, they were intended to predict success in school, and thus to help the educational system identify kids who were going to need some extra help in school. That was the original purpose that Alfred Binet developed the test of intelligence for in France.
But the widely used standardized tests of today are often controversial. One issue is the question of what these tests actually measure.
Many intelligence tests that are out there really are measuring verbal linguistics.
You've got predictor tests that measure memory and analytical abilities. You've got teachers brought up under a system who emphasize memory and analytical abilities. You've got achievement tests that measure memory and analytical abilities. Ability tests do predict achievement. And we're not opposed to that. I mean, you know, the reasonable tests. All we're saying is that if you expand the horizons and look at different kinds of skills that are important to abilities, to instruction and achievement, then different students will start to look smart.
Are there aspects of intelligence that traditional intelligence tests don't seem to measure? We think the answer is yes. And we're not the first people to say that. Bob Sternberg here at Yale, Howard Gardner up at Harvard, have similar ideas that intelligence is much broader than what intelligence tests measure.
To uncover these different facets of intelligence, Sternberg expanded the concept of intelligence to include 3 different types: analytical, creative, and practical intelligence. These divisions formed Sternberg's triarchic theory, as demonstrated by 3 of his own students at Yale.
One was Alice, who was very good in test skills. She got very good standardized test scores. She had very good grades. On paper, she was kind of the perfect student. And she proved, indeed, to be very strong in those kinds of memory skills, analytical skills. And so initially, she did very well in the program. By the end of the program, she was one of the bottom students, whereas she was very good at remembering facts and ideas and analyzing those ideas. What she wasn't so good at was coming up with her own ideas. And in life, as in school, at times you just have to come up with your own ideas and not just memorize the teachers or the textbooks. A second student, whom I call Barbara, when she applied to our program, had poor test scores for our admission standards, but she had really strong letters of recommendation, which said that she was very creative and she'd actually published research. But when the admissions committee voted on her, they voted against her 5-1. And they said, well, you know, she doesn't have the test scores, and they didn't want to take the chance. So I hired her as a research associate because I was interested in her skills, but also testing this hypothesis. And indeed, she turned out to be an excellent research associate, and 2 years later was admitted as the top pick to the program. So she was someone who was very high in creative skills, but not so strong in the memory and analytical ones, and so she didn't show up well on tests, because tests of the traditional kinds don't measure these creative skills. Now, a third kind of skill was exemplified by a student whom I call Celia. And Celia was someone who applied to our program, and her grades were good but not great. Pretty much everything in her application portfolio was good but not great. So we admitted her, and then she turned out to be good but not great. So that time we were right. But the interesting thing about Celia was that when she went on the job market, she cleaned up. She got, I think, all of the jobs she applied for because she was someone who was very strong in practical intelligence or common sense. She could figure out what the places were looking for, who were doing the hiring, and then do it. And in contrast to her was a guy called Paul, who had very strong analytical and creative skills. So many of the other professors thought he would be very successful. I said, you must be kidding. He's so low in practical intelligence, he won't be able to hide it the one day he needs to hide it, which is the day he has the job interview.
I would just go and tell them that they're no longer needed with this corporation. Just get them out. Because if they're not doing their job, then they don't deserve to be with the company.
So he went to the job interviews, bombed the interviews, and ended up getting the worst job he applied for. So the basic idea then of the theory is that you need creative skills and attitudes to come up with ideas, and you need analytical skills and attitudes to be able to evaluate whether your ideas are any good, because everyone sometimes has bad ideas. And you need practical skills and attitudes, the Celia-like ones, in order to make your ideas work and to persuade other people to listen to you with regard to those ideas. And so that's how I came across these different kinds of intelligence, which I sometimes have referred to as triarchic, just simply referring to 3.
As the triarchic theory implies, we could be gifted in some areas and weaker in others. But for some, their weaknesses can be an obstacle to learning. Psychology professor Joyce Bishop of Golden West College in California, at an early age, had difficulty keeping up in school.
I noticed as a student, even in elementary school, that some classes were very easy for me, and some classes were so difficult I felt like I was in a classroom where they weren't even speaking English. It was very, very difficult. And because I was a quiet, compliant kid and tended to get B's, I was never red flagged at all. So it was never diagnosed that I had a learning disability. When I read a paragraph, by the time I'm done at the bottom of the paragraph, I've forgotten what it was about. So long sentences on long paragraphs have always been a problem for me, but I didn't know why. And in 1983, when I read the first work that was published by Howard Gardner out of Harvard on multiple intelligences, it made so much sense. He has videotaped teachers of all different levels, excellent instructors and not so excellent, all over the country, and he found they addressed only two learning styles, the verbal linguistic, so all language related, and logical mathematical. And there's at least 8 intelligences. He's working currently on the 9th and estimates there's probably more than 20.
In addition to linguistic and mathematical intelligences, Gardner's theory includes spatial intelligence, bodily kinesthetic, musical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist intelligence.
And Howard Gardner believes that we should observe students learning and we analyze how they learn best. The first week of every one of my classes now, I really work with students to try and understand their learning style and their interpersonal style, because it makes all the difference in the world. If you're high, like in verbal linguistic, they do great in lecture. They should never, ever miss lecture. They should get all the textbooks, read them carefully, because they do learn a lot through language. Whereas if a student is very bodily kinesthetic, they absolutely have to try to form a study group where they can meet with other students and literally act out things or pace while they're talking, because their brain isn't engaged unless their body's engaged.
More extreme variations in a person's abilities are not unlike what we see in savants, many of whom are diagnosed with autism.
Some people have remarkable abilities in a single specific area, but very minimal abilities in other areas, and we call those people savants. They're people who are mentally challenged. They may not be able to hold a job and to function as normal functioning adults, and yet you tell them a date from the distant past and they'll tell you instantly what day of the week it is, or you give them a very complex mathematical computation that would take a calculator, and they're a human calculator. They can come up with a computation in an instant. And they demonstrate for us that intelligence sometimes does come in special packages. They're sort of extreme forms of what's true of most of us, that we have gifts of a peculiar kind. I have gifts, the next person has gifts, and our two gifts may not be the same, and that's part of human diversity.
Autistics tend to be visual thinkers. I think totally in pictures. I don't have any language-based thought. When I read something, I translate it into a movie. When the cattle are in the crowd...
High-functioning autistic people who know how to speak, they can understand language, but they have troubles with understanding other people's mental states and what they believe, and in particular the social emotions. And so we've shown autistic children, high-functioning autistic children, have trouble understanding these really complex social emotions.
Is the ability to read the emotions of others a type of intelligence? Psychologists Peter Salovey and John Mayer believe so. Their research into emotional intelligence was inspired while noticing that smart people can sometimes do not-so-smart things.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House! Ah!
We were interested in modern conceptions of intelligence and then public figures who are smart but seem to get themselves into trouble due to lapses in judgment.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Why is it that some people who score well on conventional intelligence tests still do dumb things or still may have problems interpersonally?
Give me my money!
Our own belief is that there's a wisdom in dealing with one's own feelings, the feelings of others, emotional information more generally, that is especially not captured in conventional understandings of what it means to be intelligent. In everyday interaction with other people, we rely on our skills having to do with the processing of emotional information. So I'm talking to someone and I have to decide when it is they want to interrupt me, or when are they becoming bored with me, or I'm talking to somebody I work with and are they unhappy about what I'm saying. I am using cues that they give in their posture, in their face, maybe in their words, about how they're feeling to make inferences about them and to adjust my behavior accordingly.
By the way, that is a really lovely tie.
Thank you.
You know what? I got my father that same tie for Christmas.
You're kidding.
I did.
Now, the components that we primarily focus on are identifying emotions, and this is identifying emotions in faces, in artistic stimuli, in one's own body. Second might be understanding emotion. This has to do with really understanding and using emotional language. A third component might be using emotion to motivate behavior, to be more creative, to solve problems, to get oneself geared up to do something. And then fourth, regulating emotion, that is, strategically changing one's emotions or other people's emotions in ways that are adaptive in the situation. In our research, we found that emotional intelligence predicts, for example, satisfaction with one's interpersonal relations. It seems to predict teachers' ratings of kids' behavior in the classroom. It appears to predict workplace outcomes like the recommendations that one's boss will make about a salary increase at the end of the year.
Well, I've spent the last...
We use the phrase emotional intelligence because we think it's a mental ability or a set of mental abilities that are related to each other in the way that an intelligence has components that are related to each other. I would not have really a problem using the word competence to describe them, however. Some people think of a competence as something that is developed and learned. We think these skills that we call emotional intelligence have both a genetic basis and a learned basis.
Given the myriad of genetic possibilities and vast differences between cultural experiences, we might expect to see differences in score averages between various ethnic groups. But these differences are often a flashpoint for debate.
Part of what makes intelligence tests controversial is that different groups have differed in their average intelligence test score. Now, two things need to be said about that. One, we're talking about averages, not individuals, and the distributions are overlapping. Two, there may be explanations for why those average differences exist in terms of unequal opportunities.
When you're looking at groups like African Americans compared to whites, or Latinos compared to whites and Asians, or something of that sort, these big group differences, those groups have such vast differences in experience with regard to education in the United States, and opportunity and equality of education, and the value their own communities place on education and their effectiveness at implementing their values. There's so many factors that are involved there.
Could it be that some test content favors certain ethnic or socioeconomic groups?
I don't know of an intelligence test that does not have a built-in bias. And the built-in bias is that of the people that construct it, because they cannot imagine all the situations that could differ for that child. And let me give you an example that is not about ethnicity. In the city of Seattle, in kindergarten, all children are given a test, basically to assess where they are in terms of vocabulary. And many children fail the question where they are asked to describe what is a cascade. Their answer is a mountain, because there is a range of mountains east of the city called the Cascades, and the children at age 5 cannot distinguish between the application of cascade to the mountain versus cascade to the waterfall. And in the city of Seattle, the children failed that question. Does that mean they're less intelligent? I think they're responding to a cue in their own environment. And that example is not ethnically coded, but we find those kinds of problems in intelligence tests as well as achievement tests all over the United States.
Charges of a bias in the test content did not seem to explain the consistent gender differences in math test scores.
The stereotype there is that men and boys are just much better at math. It's really hard to imagine that it's got to do with differences in brain functioning or something, because it doesn't appear until late high school, and it's only in one very specific aspect of mathematics, namely complex problem solving.
And this was a puzzle, because one would think that they might not do as well as men because they weren't as prepared or something, but here they were just as prepared, just as talented by all indicators, and yet in these advanced courses they were not doing as well. The same was not true in English courses.
Claude Steele and his colleagues then followed a hunch and began a landmark experiment.
We got women and men who were just as good as each other in math, very talented, top 15% of Michigan students in math, and we gave them a difficult math test. Steve Spencer and I came up with the idea of saying just before they took the test, you may have heard that women are not as good as men on these difficult standardized math tests. You may have heard that, referring to the stereotype. But that's not true for this particular math test. On this particular math test, women always do just as well as men. They always have and they always will. So with that simple instruction, we've made that situation a very different situation for them. Now, as they take the test, the frustration they experience can't be attributed to anything about their being a woman. Under that circumstance, women perform just as well as the men. And it really is that experiment and that particular finding that launched the idea of stereotype threat. Stereotype threat refers to the fact that people can be under threat of stereotypes, in the sense that if you're performing or behaving in an area where a negative stereotype about a group that you're a part of, where that stereotype is relevant, you can feel some pressure that, boy, am I going to confirm this thing that they think about us? Is this true of us? When that domain where you're performing in is important to you and to society in general, that kind of pressure can be very strong and powerful. We psychologists are skeptical until we see evidence of things. And I think when we were doing this work in those days, were skeptical that something like a stereotype being relevant could be that powerful as to, in these experiments, to lower women's math performance by a full standard deviation, which is a very substantial effect on performance. We were skeptical it could have this kind of an effect, but it did.
If the differences between boys and girls in math scores were only genetic, we would not have seen the huge improvement in scores that we have seen in the past 15 years. And that improvement is a direct reflection of the interventions that have been done both in terms of curriculum as well as in creating possible selves of girls as mathematicians.
Most of the women who succeed in math have fathers or brothers or somebody who told them that they could do it. And that all they had to do is hang in there and focus on this and work at it. That they weren't always being stereotyped, that people aren't always thinking of them that way. And it kind of relaxes them in the situation, having these kind of trusted relationships that are cross-group relationships. A strong predictor of African American grade performance at the college level is a cross-group relationship.
These examples demonstrate a strong social and environmental influence on test performance and the development of intelligence.
You might have many environmental factors going for you, but if, for example, you're in a society that suppresses dissent or that suppresses certain forms of creativity, even if you have lots of abilities, it may never come out, because if it does, you're dead and they kill you.
And what about the role of genes?
Most researchers in the field of intelligence believe that intelligence represents some combination, some interaction between genes and environment. So I think that there are very few people today who would say that genes play no role, and at the same time, there are probably no people who would say that environment plays no role. Rather, the genes you have interact with the environment in which you live in order to produce the kind of intelligence you have. There's also a concept known as emergenesis, where the idea is that the genes for abilities may not be totally additive. In other words, if you have some of this and some of that and some of the other thing, none of those individually might make someone particularly smart or creative, but those things in combination may result in someone's being smarter, more creative.
We're talking about not 3 or 4 or 5 or even 30, 40 or 50, but 300, 400, 500 genes, each of which contribute a small amount of the variance to a particular trait, like, say, reading disability. And there are ways now where we can easily, if we had those, say, 500 genes, we can easily assess them in psychological studies. And it comes back to you the next day, and then you've got a genetic risk indicator. If you get that gene set that's predicting reading disability at, say, 7 or 8 or 9 years of age, how early does it appear? Does it appear in language at 2 and 3 years of age?
And early detection may mean early intervention. For Joyce Bishop, intervention did not come until later in life.
It wasn't until I was 35 and my doctor sent me to a center in Los Angeles, and they determined I am able to understand what I hear on a 4th grade level.
And that says, VAPS, show me apps.
And that hasn't changed even at my age today. She asked me how far did I get through school. And by then I was feeling a little spunky, so I asked her to guess. And she guessed the 10th grade. And so then I told her I was working on my second master's degree. And she pushed her chair back and she said, "Wow, you work really hard in school, don't you?" And I immediately, big crocodile tears went down my face. But for the first time, it was acknowledged that I was trying very, very hard. Where before that, people just thought I didn't care and I wasn't paying attention. And it was amazing that once I knew what was wrong, it's very easy for me to work around it now.
Advances in genetic testing may also point to interventions specific to a particular disability.
If we've got the most direct genetic measure possible, that is DNA variation, we can then incorporate it in our studies of the environment and look at the way in which the genetic risk, say for reading, interacts with the environment. So if there's an environmental intervention, it might work differently. Like a reading program might work better for some children than others based on genetic differences. That would be an example of a gene-environment interaction. That's the hot topic now that everybody's talking about, because in recent years there have been a few papers that show that genetic differences interact with specific environments. But I think a larger topic that people haven't talked about that I think will be even more important in psychology is gene-environment correlation, the way in which genetic factors expose children to different environments. And once we get these genes, that will be, I think, one of the more interesting aspects of the nature-nurture interplay.
85 words.
Inside Out is a 22-part series about psychology. For information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online.